The subject of tonight's stream, simulation theory and quantum immortality. I'm not a huge fan of either theory, particularly simulation theory. But in both cases, I've had a number of experiences that make it impossible for me to write either one off at the same time. So uh, let's get into it. Simulation theory, I don't know whose theory it is, but I'm sure you guys are all aware it's basically the theory that we're in some sort of simulation, either a future civilization or aliens or who knows, right? um, and the evidence to support this, there's a bunch of different things that people cite. One of them being the Planck's length, the smallest possible measurement or size in the universe, as kind of corresponding to a pixel. The speed of light having a limit correlating to processing limitation, right? And there's a guy that has people smoke DMT and they look at a laser and they see the same code. Um, what else? People cite the Mandela effect. The observer effect I've also heard cited, and that one's real sketchy because that is one of the most abused concepts in all of science. It is definitely not an accepted fact that observation, in terms of consciousness acting upon the wave function, causes a collapse. It's not outside of the realm of possibility, but there are all kinds of other possible interpretations. Um, the Planck's length also, if you think about it in terms of like a nested observer window theory, that there's actually a observer window at that scale, and that actually kind of helps determine or ensure a sort of consensus reality along with entanglement, right? One of the objections to observer theory being that, why doesn't everyone just create their own reality to the extent that, like, we don't have a consensus reality. Those things might answer that question without. Um, Anyways, not really the point. The point is, and the reason that I don't like simulation theory is that it really seems like an attempt to sidestep confrontation with the fact that there must be some sort of teleological principle in the universe or even a creator, right? And if you doubt the bias is that extreme amongst our academics, consider the cosmological constant and the fact that the normal p-value that constitutes ruling something out as possibly being chance is 100 orders of magnitude less than the cosmological constant. And despite that, and this is, as far as I can tell, the only case in all of science where they have just, adjusted their protocol or parameters, in order to say, okay, well, it's still chance, even though 100 orders of magnitude less, normally we would say there's no possibility that this is chance. That doesn't make sense. It's not scientific. And because of the way our academic nervous system, I guess, is constituted, all of these little siloed research programs get funneled up to like the apex window, right? And at that apex, there's only like 5 people that determine what is going to become part of the mainstream ontological model, basically. So it's one of those rare circumstances where a sort of conspiratorial level of epistemic control is actually viable, right? It's highly suspicious. And so then you can ask, even if this layer is a simulation, is it simulations all the way down? And the obvious elephant in the room is that simulation theory basically is acknowledging this couldn't have happened by chance. There must be a creator. So even if you invoke aliens or future civilizations as running a simulation, who's running their simulation? Where did they come from? It does absolutely nothing to answer like the major ontological question or the theological question or the teleological question. It seems to me like it's sort of like a collective, uh, collective, like the materialist paradigm, collective ego trying to evade embarrassment, you know? And I don't think that's what we need. Redintegrating ourselves into a holistic experience of the universe is the only medicine that is going to lift us up out of this nihilistic existential crisis that, is threatening our continued existence. So, like if you just follow this idea to its inevitable conclusion, all it's really saying is there must be some kind of intelligence underlying the universe or creator. And it really just seems like kind of a like bitch ass like attempt to really, really transparent attempt to evade that confrontation. And it really makes me wonder, why are we so determined to remove that possibility from our universe? Right? I mean, I find it highly suspicious. Like, are we really that diabolically devious that we fear the possibility that there could be a God to that extent? And certainly the institutionalized religions have done us no favors in that regard. The binarity of, human cognitive processes also, I don't think, is really helpful. People tend to want to categorize things as either or, black and white. It's like either there's a sky god creator from one of the old storybooks that are obviously insane and make no sense and promote all sorts of toxic psychological, you know what I mean? That obviously these things are garbage. But if you are unbiased and observe the universe with a high degree of intelligence, it appears to me that throughout history, all of the people that meet those qualifications have at least acknowledged there must be at least some kind of teleological principle at work. So, when you have two extremes, the middle ground is almost always the truth. And this brings us to one of the obvious dangers of empiricism and why it actually serves to maintain empire, right? Because at a certain point, you are sort of boxed in to the degree that common sense is negated in favor of empirical data, right? And when that empirical data is beyond the reaches of laboratorial confirmation or, it's not demonstrable, it's not measurable, it's not testable, but common sense can, you can extract it from multi-domain pattern recognition and synthesis, and come to a pretty reasonable conclusion about what must be true. Empiricism, when it is over enthusiastically adhered to, negates common sense to the point where otherwise intelligent people become fucking morons. And that's what we're living in right now. You know, there's another aspect of that, and it's also true that, and this is what it is, it's also true that if, for example, the observer effect is legitimate, we can't trust any of the results that we get from laboratory grade physics because their expectations are going to be influencing their results. And there's no way around it. And there wouldn't be a lot of conflict there because most of them have been programmed to have the same general expectations in terms of what they're going to find. The fact that we have determined things like the cosmological constant that are way outside of their expectations kind of, throws a wrench in that possibility. But the truth doesn't need our participation. Only bullshit does, or permission. God, there was one other aspect of that that I wanted to make sure I threw out there. I feel like it's going to evade me. Something to do with the oh yeah, and then also we have our predictive processing in our nervous system, right? We when you are indoctrinated, or when a high priority prior is installed when you're very young, it is going to actually edit your perceptions in order to maintain whatever generative model your nervous system has come up with. This also makes even the most rigorous scientific data questionable. And it's it's more applicable to experience. For example, a lot of my experiences with synchronicities and intuition and stuff, the conventional belief about this would be that I was either delusional or a pathological liar when compared to conventional experience, right? But if your nervous system is set up when you're very young so that it's going to edit these kind of experiences, you know what I mean? That kind of consensus reality integration, it kind of explains that disparity between our experiences. And then it applies also to how we appraise and evaluate various theoretical models. So, it is true that there do seem to be a very large constituency of people that actually qualify as NPCs. I've actually seen people that believe that they are NPCs themselves, and a lot of my anomalous experiences also kind of suggest that maybe this isn't exactly real for everyone. Another strange experience that I had involved an ayahuasca experience where I was told that I am sort of an avatar of this being from Sirius. And then a few years later, this NSA whistleblower said that, a lot of people on this earth are just avatars of these beings on other planets. And that struck me as really odd. And it also sounds an awful lot like a video game type simulation, like a RPG, like the Earth RPG or something. But at any rate, the fundamental point that I'm making about the simulation theory is that they're literally acknowledging there has to be some kind of intelligence or creator. And then because the operating system of the organic universe, because that's reflected in our technology, which we would just intuitively constructed based on the operating principle of the fucking universe. I mean, it's not, it's just not that compelling to me at all that there's some connection between the structure of the universe and the way that our technology operates. It's basically meaningless as far as I can tell. And teleology seems a lot more likely to me. Is God a person, a thing, a force? Well, what I actually kind of think about this is it's the only thing that makes sense to me is that it's a recursive co-creative process, right? That what we call God is immanent in the sense that if there is a sort of omniscient, omnipotent being, it will be the end result of the process of the evolution of the universe. That the complexification and development of its creation is informing the development of its consciousness in the same way that human experience informs our development. And every single generative mechanism in the universe is recursive like that. So it just makes sense to me that there has to be a reason for everything. I don't think anything happens without purpose. And, that brings me back to this whole neural gating thing. I kind of missed the point when I tried to explain this before, but the prevalent opinion seems to be that existence is kind of pointless and it was just this random bullshit that accidentally happened. My experience does not reflect that at all, but I have been aligned with a sense of purpose since I came out of the womb. And so my suspicion there is that it is the expectations that people have that they're purposeless that actually produce that experience. It's got nothing to do with reality. And I also suspect that if people were to attenuate their default mode network and, other aspects of their neural gating system, that belief would dissipate pretty rapidly. I also feel that it's an engineered belief because the elites know that in order to control people, they must not be sovereign. And if they're aware that they have a purpose and they're aligned with that purpose, both in, spirit and in action, then they're not going to need to be governed and they're not going to tolerate it, So, yeah, there's that. So, and somebody asked, I guess I already answered, what I think God is. And then, there's all sorts of reasons or ways to understand how there could be some sort of embedded intelligence in the universe that doesn't necessarily manifest as something with agency. That the strictures imposed upon it by its own laws sort of limit its wiggle room in terms of the effects that it can enact, Okay, so that's simulation theory, and that's pretty much all I have to say about that. But quantum immortality is maybe even dumber, at least in the way that people tend to interpret it in pop culture or the aspect people focus on. Speaking of predictive processing and cognitive bias, we really want to believe certain things, and the idea that if you die, you just move to a different timeline and keep going and don't even remember that it happened is really comforting, kind of, potentially, I guess. The obvious problem is that when you are getting old, are you just going to continue to get old and die until you're like 10,000 years old and you're just a puddle of goo on a bed, dying every nanosecond or something? Because it just, it obviously breaks down ridiculously if you just think about that really obvious aspect of it. However, I have to kind of tell this story because I have to admit that I have suspected for years that I died at a Fish concert in like 2010, and I've never really been able to completely shake it. The one thing that kind of works against it is that the sort of surreal synchronicities and whatnot I had started to experience before the concert, but the way that they picked up afterwards is what really had me thinking like something weird happened at that show. And again, like I said, it started happening before I even got there. But when I arrived, right, like I wanted to go out to the West Coast and try to somehow become associated with like the inner circle of the Grateful Dead musical scene, right? That was like a big goal of mine. And I go to this Fish concert and I step out of my car on the West Coast for the first time, and I'm the only other car in the parking lot, and the further bus is parked beside me. It turned out to be a replica. But, like what the hell? I come out there hoping to like meet that circle of people. And as soon as I get there, I park next to Kid and Kesey's son and driving a replica of the further bus. So it's, instantly it was weird. And Zane, Kesey's son, comes walking down the stairs, and at first I thought it was Ken, and I'm like, wait, you're dead. And I look at his shirt and I see Ken Kesey, and I look back up and I'm like, is that your dad? And he's like, yep. And then we both looked to the road, and there's this single tire track that was like 1.5 feet wide, and it went right through this bush. And there was like a big chunk of the bush missing. And, we're staring at this for like minutes on end, like, what the fuck just happened there? Or, what? So anyways, the entire thing was weird, the whole weekend. I'm not the biggest Fish fan. There's only certain songs that I like, the song parts, and the jams are great, but the songs get on my nerves. The entire concert, it's like I wrote the set list and handed it to Trey, and they play a different show every night. So that was weird as hell. It was literally like I wrote the set list. And then I remember feeling really, really weird. I ate like a half and ate the mushrooms, which isn't a lot, but I felt just like this like horrifically weird, almost like flu type thing, but it was really alien. And I remember going back to the tent and falling asleep and being a little bit worried, that something just wasn't right. And then I woke up and we started going home. And at the time, I was using Vicodin to manage the symptoms of a lifelong, like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and I had run out. And I don't. If you guys have ever been to Garberville in Humboldt County, there's like nothing there where the what is it called, the Highway of the Ancients or something, where the giant redwoods are, the Avenue of the Giants, right? Like right on the corner, there's this campground. There's nothing around. And as we're walking up, I see this truck with a motorcycle in the back. And I just happen to say to my girlfriend, man, I wish I could find a Vicodin. My muscles are burning. And we get up to the truck, and there's this guy leaning on it. And he goes, would you like to buy a motorcycle? And I was like, no. And he's like, how about some Vicodin? And I'm like, what the like, why? First of all, there's no one around. There's no reason to sit there and try to sell pills and I assume a stolen motorcycle. There are all kinds of places nearby that would have been way better for that purpose. It made no sense that the guy was sitting there. So I buy some of his Vicodin and we start going home. I get to Durango. We get to Durango. My girlfriend wanted to get a pack of cigarettes. I didn't need anything. So I was just going to pull up in front of the grocery store, let her run in. And I'm ranting about how I wish I could just grow weed legally so that I could fund my music and not do anything else. And I'm like yelling about this, in this total rant mode. And I pull up and stop, and I'm looking at the newspaper, and it's like medical marijuana law passed in Colorado. And I'm like, what the fuck? And the law was so lax. They had a provision in it that the patient or caregiver could decide how much marijuana they needed. So if it was like way more than the law allowed for, all you had to do was say, well, I decided I need that much. And that was actually legal. So complete free for all, and this kind of shit just continues and escalates and gets weirder and weirder and weirder for months. And I remember over and over again falling asleep and thinking I must have died at that fucking Fish concert, because this is not what reality is like, and I knew that I wasn't going crazy because a lot of these synchronicities had like physical objects associated with them that were still there the next day, like a ruler that had 2 11s on it that my girlfriend noticed had 2 11s on it while we were discussing the numerology of 11, and I'd never heard of 1111 before, and just on and on like that. But the ruler was still there the next day. At one point I was talking to this guy, older man that I almost considered like a guru, and he started going off about how time was elastic, and the time meter on my cell phone started going backwards. And I thought, okay, I've broken my brain. That last hit of DMT, I should, you know what I mean? And then my girlfriend, I didn't say anything. My girlfriend goes, do you see that? And she points at the numbers. And I'm like, okay. All kinds of shit like this for months and months and months. So I'm just putting that out there that although I see some like serious issues with this theory, I've never really been able to shake that feeling that I must have died at that Fish concert. I did do drugs back then, not just like psychedelics, but not heavily either. And I didn't seek them out or anything. So I don't know what would have happened, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that I did actually die. And that's why my experience went so far down the fucking rabbit hole from that point on. Yeah. So another issue that I have with quantum immortality and the multiverses is that I really seriously doubt there actually are like infinite dimensions or like another realm that is an afterlife or a spirit world. I think that this world is it, and that's why it's here. I really believe that the law of necessity is basically, for all intents and purposes, God. And if there wasn't a need for us to have a physical body in order to have an experience, this wouldn't exist. The universe generally does the most economic, it conserves energy. And if it was possible for us to exist in a way that didn't subject us to duality and good and evil and pain and suffering. And I mean, it just doesn't track with logic and reason that there would be like an immaterial plane if we or if there was an immaterial plane, what would we need this level of experience for? So the whole idea of the multiverse and quantum immortality just don't really track with my understanding and experience. Yeah, Nefter commented that it's a holographic universe, and I totally believe that. That's actually one of the arguments in favor of simulation theory, that basically our matter is just recombinatorial differentiation based uh, it's all composed based on these interference patterns. And that's exactly a hologram. And also the way that light functions in relation to all of that. Um, but again, I see it being far more likely that we are creating our technologies and everything else based upon the fundamental blueprints of creation, rather than, I mean, it just seems like I have no problem with Luciferianism. In fact, you might even define me generally that way, depending on what framework you're talking about. But it seems awfully Luciferian to say, okay, the universe seems to have, some of the same operating protocol, or operating system as our technology. Therefore, they must be created by some sort of being like us. That it seems like really egocentric and uh, biased. It seems like a severe under understatement or under characterization or mischaracterization. The living is the witness of eternity. Death is just like before you were born. I kind of doubt that. In fact, I heard a really good explanation of something like the quantum loop theory, but it's more individualized. If the universe exists, or if there is an infinite time, that I'm not going to try to regurgitate all this. It was really well presented, and I can't do it justice. Um, but basically, they presented the mathematically and logically, like that it's basically a certainty that you will live this exact same life again. And the way that you would experience that is that when you die, you would just come out of your same womb again. And that actually, I've struggled with that possibility quite a lot over the course of the years, because I've had a lot of precognitions that are undeniable, highly specific with dates, and just there's no way around it. And other sort of non-ordinary or non-local information access that is like 100% certain. Um, and I don't really attribute that to some sort of like mystical woo-based superpowers so much as either some sort of resonant bleed, potentially damage to my default mode network and other neural gating systems when I was drowned as a toddler. And also maybe there's more subsystem crosstalk that allows me to kind of extract from these patterns and synthesize. Um, but that the possibility that it's sort of like a deja vu from having done this same exact life, an infinite number of times, it feels right. And that is, of course, extremely disconcerting. Being doomed to that degree of repetition is pretty much literally hell. I've made a lot of mistakes in my journey, and I would hope to hell that if we are stuck repeating this life, that we at least have some hope of making some at least slight alterations in our decisions. Also, I think that if this is the case, it's probably inevitably true that we do actually improve across all these iterations, because that's what the universe would be doing. The reason it is expanding and contracting is conservation of information so that it can refine its laws and hence our experience across iterations. This is a very good way to explain fine tuning without invoking creationism, right? So that's really all I have to say about that. I just felt like I needed to weigh in on those things because they're getting so popular, and quantum immortality just seems kind of like patently stupid to me, so it didn't really deserve or warrant like that much consideration even. But the simulation theory does really bug the shit out of me, just because of that aspect of it just really feeling like the culture in general, the institution of science are kind of backed into a corner where at this point, even the science says there has to be at least some kind of teleological principle. And people are responding like, well, it must be aliens, And it's like, come on, man, don't be such a pussy. If your life is that diabolically depraved that you're that afraid there might be a creator, just straighten yourself out, you know? So anyways, guys, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It looks like my camera froze, which is always, at least I'm not in some grotesque facial expression pose, which is usually what happens. But thank you guys so much for spending this time with me. I will be back probably tomorrow. Saturday, I'm going to finally publish the interview with Dr. Stanley Krippner, which I'm excited about. It was really brief. We only had a half an hour, basically due to his age. But he did express an interest in doing another session, which I might actually be able to do in person in Cuenca in May at the Brain and Consciousness Conference that will also feature Stuart Hammeroff and Dr. I think it's Gomez Marin, who is pretty brilliant and one of those rare academics that is able to balance rigor and openness. So super excited also at the possibility that Krippner may be able to make some introductions, and that could lead to interviews with people like Hammeroff and Dr. Marin. And by the way, it's a great reason to support us, because if I do this, it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to be totally worth it for our community if I'm able to engage these people, because I will definitely ask questions that I don't really see being presented to people at that like tier of academia. So if you support that mission, please consider supporting the channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.